Welcome to this DW Business special, asking what the big tech jobs cull means for Silicon Valley. To answer that question, and hopefully many others, I'm joined by Wall Street tech analyst Dan Ives. Dan, it's great to have you with us. Thanks so much for being here.
Great to be here, thanks.
I mean, these are tough times to be working in big tech, aren't they?
Look, I mean, tech firms were spending like 1980s rock stars for the last decade, and now, at least on hypergrowth, the clock struck midnight. You're starting to see cuts across the board, and that's what Wall Street wants to see. So we're clearly going through some pain in big tech. You know, I'd say I went similar to what we saw in 2009, 2010 in terms of some of those layoffs.
That's what I want to get into with you, actually, is about the precedent for this. But let's just talk through some of the numbers to start with, because 2023 is proving a rough one if you work in the tech sector, with tens of thousands of job losses announced by the industry's biggest players already. Let's take a look at a few of those. First off, Microsoft has said that it's slashing its global workforce by 10,000 as it reacts to a drop in spending on gadgets. Times are tough, and tech isn't a priority, it would appear. Google is shedding 12,000 staff, blaming what it calls a new economic reality in the wake of the pandemic. Amazon is laying off the biggest number of people. It kicked off the year saying 18,000 jobs would go. Meanwhile, towards the end of 2022, Facebook owner Meta said it was terminating the jobs of 11,000 staff. So Dan Ives, I counted around about 50,000 jobs being shed there, but I did read earlier that there's something like 200,000 jobs have gone in tech since the start of last year. Have we experienced anything on this scale?
Look, I think if you look during the pandemic, these companies were spending at a pace that was really unsustainable and historic. I mean, Microsoft added 75,000 employees since 2019 because of the demand environment. So we're in unprecedented territory, but I also do believe for tech, they're cutting costs in a lot of areas, non-strategic, but they're still going to invest in a lot of these next-gen areas. Cloud, look at ChatGPT from Microsoft, look at some of these other areas across what I believe Apple, Amazon. So I do believe that's a sort of theme that we're going to see over the coming months and year.
I think one thing we should discuss is whether or not the tech firms should have seen this coming. I mean, you talk about the enormous number of people that they took on during the course of the pandemic. I mean, did they really believe that the conditions that were there during the pandemic were going to continue up until this point?
Look, I think that's going to be a debate. Did they misjudge what the demand environment was going to be? Clearly, on the COVID overhang, post-pandemic, you're going to see a major drop-off in demand. I think a lot of these companies were not quick enough to act. Now you're starting to see them rip the Band-Aid off. I think some did maybe more prudent, like an Apple. That's a good example. But others, I think, were spending aggressively, and investors were fine with it. But now that environment's quickly changed on Wall Street, and that's a big, I think, sort of headline here as these tech firms navigate a very uncertain 2023.
Things are very uncertain. It's not a great time to be entering the jobs market, is it, for these tens of thousands of people, particularly with cost of living being an issue in so many different places. But the jobs market must be getting pretty congested now in Silicon Valley.
I think it's congested, but I do believe, especially engineers, software developers, some specialized marketing, they're going to have, I think, many choosers, in terms of the opportunities, because one company's loss is another's gain. You go back to other periods, and I've covered tech since the late 90s. You go through 2002, 2003, a lot of companies that we're talking about today, the behemoths, I mean, they were able to really hire significantly during those periods. 2009, 2010, same. So who could be the next Facebook, the next Amazon? I think that's going to create opportunities for those companies that are able to opportunistically spend.
Let's get back to talking about the job cuts themselves, because I want to actually look at the reasons that the big tech firms have given for why they're taking all of these these decisions on mass layoffs. I mean, no big public statements so far, but chief execs have been addressing their workers to explain to them why they're cutting their jobs. In a memo to staff, Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella said they were living in times of significant change, with customers who accelerated their digital spending during the pandemic now spending less on tech, or as he puts it, optimizing their digital spend. Meanwhile, Sundar Pichai told Google employees that over the past 2 years, the company saw periods of dramatic growth. To match that growth, it hired for, as he puts it, for a different economic reality than the one that we face today. I think basically what you can read into that is that they need less staff now than they needed during the course of the pandemic. Wall Street tech analyst Dan Ives, who joins us, do those statements tell the full story, that they just hired too many people?
I think it tells half the story. I think part of it was that investors were fine with them just spending mass money, especially when you look at Google on some of these projects. Look at Facebook on Metaverse. That's another example. Clock struck midnight now for hypergrowth. The tech companies, culturally, they're going to have to change. It's been a magic carpet ride in Silicon Valley since 2010. And I think now there's some pain ahead. And I think that's what these tech firms are sort of navigating. But I do believe the CEOs, there's some blame there as well in terms of the pace that they're hiring and not stopping it.
Yeah, is there also a failure in the fact that the tech companies haven't been able to move nimbly enough to maintain the demand that they managed to achieve during the pandemic, and actually to keep the business going and be able to keep these people on?
Look, I think part of it is that a once-in-a-100-year pandemic, the tailwind to tech was unprecedented. And I think it was very difficult for these companies. I mean, you, of course, poster child like Zoom and some of the collaboration players, what that was going to look like. Social media, what was digital advertising going to look like? It's definitely hard to peg. And now you're seeing some of the pain on the other side of it.
Is the post-pandemic dip, to some extent, an excuse that is allowing these firms, because as you mentioned, they're having to adapt to great change. Is this actually just giving them an opportunity and a reason they can give for slashing jobs so they can adopt new strategies?
It's like cleaning out your basement, not needing that third grade homework that you kept from your kid. I think that is a little what's happening here. Some of the non-strategic areas, Microsoft, they could cut costs in hardware. Apple could cut costs on speech, on Siri, and some of the others. So I do think it gives some of these companies opportunities to sort of clear the decks and level set for the future.
Well, let's take a look at how those strategies are changing. This strategic pivot by tech to cope with the downturn means scrapping, or at least temporarily pulling back on some of the big bets that they've made in the past few years. So the strategies the tech industry appears to be leaving behind include AR, augmented reality, and VR, virtual reality, with Microsoft reportedly scrapping its HoloLens virtual reality headset. Then Amazon says it's firing people in its home devices business, including their Alexa voice assistant range. Netflix is cutting back on content spending to reduce costs. Meanwhile, the glut of tech bought in the pandemic has meant the likes of PCs or Peloton bikes are no longer being bought in large numbers. So where do tech firms think the future lies then? Well, Meta is still committing billions to virtual reality despite other cutbacks. Others cutting back indeed, sorry. Apple is looking at bringing in the making of more of the technology for its computers and phones in-house. Meanwhile, the biggest battleground does appear to be artificial intelligence, with Microsoft investing $10 billion in the firm OpenAI. It's just emerged, with hopes of challenging Google's dominant position in research. Let's bring Dan Ives back in. Is there a lot of soul-searching going on in big tech? Are firms like Microsoft and Meta having to reassess what they're for?
Look, Meta is a good example. I mean, that metaverse strategy Zuckerberg is going to significantly cut back on. And ever since he announced that he's cutting back on it, stock's up 50%. Because that's what Wall Street wants to see. You look at Microsoft, they're going to stay in the left lane of innovation. That's why they did the OpenAI ChatGPT for $10 billion. Because this is not the time to ultimately really rest. They need to invest in areas like artificial intelligence, like cloud, like cybersecurity, where other areas, even like AR, VR, that could start to go toward the back of the line.
We will talk a bit more about AI shortly, but if people are cutting their spending on hardware, does that mean that we're seeing tech firms moving to areas where people can make sort of smaller spends, like on services and subscriptions and stuff like that?
I do think software services plays much more of a role. I think that's something that we're going to see play out. That's been one of the big strengths with a name like Apple in terms of software services. And look, it also depends on the consumer environment. I mean, do we get a soft landing or a hard landing? And what the impact that could be on the consumer spend, not just 2023, but 2024. That's an important dynamic as well.
Because when we've talked about tech firms traditionally, I think we tended to think about, physical technology, but really that's changing, isn't it? To tech firms being something that exists as more of a sort of conceptual thing than a physical item.
It's become more virtual, more software driven, both on the enterprise and on the consumer side. You look at the social media players in terms of how they played. So yeah, no doubt, there's a huge evolution that's happened here across tech.
Well, just stay with us, Dan, but one technology that we've already mentioned that I said I wanted to go into a bit further, and that is obviously making waves, is artificial intelligence. And that is because Microsoft has said it is investing $10 billion in the company behind the successful ChatGPT chatbot. That company is OpenAI. It believes that AI can help boost its search engine and even take on Google's dominance. Meanwhile, Google's actually been working on its own AI tools, which it's yet to make available to the public. In fact, AI is already helping banks to detect fraud, logistics companies to reduce disruption, and, of course, for apps to suggest new content. Let's bring Dan Ives back in. Is dominance of the artificial intelligence market the next big battle?
That's the arms race. I think that's really the next frontier. And first shot across the bow is Microsoft in terms of what they've done with, ChatGPT, Google, Amazon, Apple, Facebook. They're going to have to respond. I think this is going to be significant areas of spend. We're talking potentially in the 50, 60, 70 billion.
Wow. You talk about Microsoft's move for OpenAI being the first shot across the bow. For many of us who've only just come across OpenAI and ChatGPT, we've suddenly been very surprised by the abilities of artificial intelligence. Have big tech firms been just as much taken by surprise by this? Because you'd think they've been maybe a bit ahead of the game on this, not finding this stuff out at the same pace as the rest of us.
They were investing. I think the difference is that the algorithm and the technologies has gotten to a point and no one expected where we are. I mean, ChatGPT, that's lightning in a bottle. We've clearly seen significant technology come out of China, but now you're starting to see being integrated in the consumer and in the enterprise. And I think that's really been the golden goose now as tech firms are realizing the monetization opportunity of AI.
How fast should we expect this to move? By the end of 2023, are we going to see a very different tech landscape to the start of it, driven by all these developments in AI? Or is it a bit like Meta and its metaverse, something that it's thinking is going to happen, in a decade's time?
No, yeah. I mean, if you contrast that, metaverse, again, we're talking latter part of the decade. ChatGPT AI, we're talking 9, 12 months. You're going to see more and more technology integrated on the consumer, on the enterprise side. I think this is a game changer in terms of tech.
Okay, well, Dan Ives, that's all we've got time for this time around. But thank you so much for bringing us your expertise here. It's always a pleasure to have you on. That's Wall Street tech analyst and MD of Wedbush Securities, Dan Ives. Thank you so much to you also for watching us. If you have enjoyed this, do make sure you check out one of our other DW Business specials. We'll see you over there. Goodbye.